Amen. We don't know much about John the Revelator, who wrote the words that we read today. There is much scholarly debate about many aspects of his life, including just exactly how many Johns were hanging out with Jesus. Just as it is today, in biblical times, John was a very popular name. But what we do know about the author of this text is that he was in a cave when he wrote these words. He was in a cave on the island of Patmos. John was there because he had been banished, which was a common punishment in those days for dissenters, prophesiers, and Christians. John had been separated from his community, his church, and all of those that he loved. And back home, his people were being persecuted. They were being imprisoned and banished and killed for their faith. Jake and I had the opportunity to travel to the cave on the island of Patmos, where John received these words. And so I can tell you firsthand that it is a dark place. It is cold. It is open to the elements on one side. And at the time in which he was sheltering there, it was very isolated. And so John, cut off from his community, in despair about the state of the world, worried about his people, in the darkness of the cave and in the cold, he curled up and he put his head on a rock and he closed his eyes. And then, into that dark cave, into the isolation and the despair, came a vision. John was given a vision that has captured the Christian imagination ever since. It was a vision full of color and symbolism and overflowing with life. In it, John saw people from every nation and every race and every background being ushered into the throne room of God, into God's very arms. And they weren't just anyone. These people were distinctive. They were distinctive because they were so tired. They had suffered so much. They had bled. They had cried. They had, the text tells us, come out of great persecution and many trials. That was their commonality, for they were from every background imaginable. But here, in the throne room of God, they were gathered together, all as one. And the dirt and the dust and the blood and the tears had been washed away. And they were singing. We are not enduring banishment from the Roman Empire, you and I. We are not living in a physical cave. But over the course of this year, we've learned a little something about dark places. We have learned a little something about isolation. Many of us have learned a little bit about looking out on the state of the world and the state of our nation and feeling dismayed. We know, too, a little bit about grief. Many of us here this morning have lost someone that we could not bear to lose. someone perhaps whose candle is here on this table. And all of us are here with the weight of our nation's dead on our shoulders. 230,000 from COVID alone. 230,000 and counting. Almost the entire population of Cumberland County we have lost this year. And so what? What can an ancient vision from a man in a cave tell us that could possibly help us? What could the book of Revelation, of all things, with its strange imagery and its long history of cultural misuse, have to say to us this morning about grief? Well, it does not answer our questions about death. Because like the rest of the Bible, when it comes to this area, it is high on symbolism and low on details. But it does tell us this. It tells us that God comes into caves. God comes into isolation and grief. God comes to wherever we are huddled. And in that space, God does things that boggle the mind. God creates visions of color and music and new life, hope where there was no hope, rest where there has been no rest, a washing away of grief or fear or weariness, enough so that it is possible to move forward or get up or muster hope for tomorrow. The message of John of Patmos, John the Revelator, is that God does not abandon us in our time of grief or isolation or despair. And God does not abandon us in death, whether on this side or on the other side of the veil. John took his vision that he had received, and he sent it, all of it, the crazy animals and the fire and the angels. He sent it off to the persecuted and the downtrodden Christians all over the Roman Empire. He sent it to them, and they received it, and it gave them hope. It gave them enough spiritual fuel to keep fighting and to keep the faith. For there is a fierce freedom in the knowledge that God is with us through anything that life can bring. There is liberation in the knowledge that all the hardships and the grief and the despair and the isolation, and even that bitterest enemy of all, death, cannot keep us from God or keep God from us. That these things do not ever have the last word, but that they will be replaced by color and song and rest and rejoicing. Armed with this knowledge, with this profound confidence, we can live and strive and fight in this world to make God's love visible. For God's love is the end of the story, just as it is the beginning. It is the Alpha, just as it is the Omega. It is a force that invades every cave, every tomb, both here on earth and those that exist in the recesses of our hearts and minds. God's love is the answer to every question, and it is the guide to our every action. And so